Montana Territory, 1868. The sky stretched endless above the Blackfoot Valley, a tapestry of stars watching over a land where a man's word was his bond and silence his shield. Thomas Sutherland believed in both with the conviction of his 25 years, years that had taught him the brutal arithmetic of frontier survival. Trust no one, depend on yourself, and never, under any circumstances, let your guard down. The West had no place for sentimentality. It was a place for men who could weather its storms alone. Thomas guided his dun gelding along the eastern edge of his modest cattle spread, eyes scanning the horizon with the practiced wariness of a man who'd buried his parents at 16 and his brother 2 winters later. The Winchester in his saddle scabbard was as much a part of him as his own right arm. His lean frame, hardened by years of ranch work, carried the easy confidence of youth, but his eyes, those striking blue eyes beneath the shadow of his weathered hat, held the weight of someone much older. A man who opens his heart on the frontier is just digging his own grave. His father had told him before a Sioux raiding party proved the wisdom of those words. Thomas had built his life around that truth, speaking little to the folks in nearby Silver Creek, keeping relationships cordial but distant. His handsome features, sun-bronzed skin, and the light stubble that framed his strong jaw caught attention when he ventured into town for supplies, but he never lingered longer than necessary. What Thomas wanted was simple: to build his ranch into something substantial, something that would stand as testament to his endurance in a land that took more often than it gave. What he told himself he didn't need, what he'd convinced himself was a dangerous luxury, was companionship beyond his loyal cattle dog and the occasional conversation with neighboring ranchers. But sometimes, in the deepest part of night when the coyotes called to one another across the valley, a hollow ache would spread through his chest, a yearning for something he couldn't name but feared all the same. The early summer of 1868 brought unseasonal rains to the Blackfoot Valley, swelling creeks beyond their banks and washing out portions of the trail connecting Silver Creek to Helena. Thomas hadn't planned on riding into town that Wednesday in June, but when the skies finally cleared, his dwindling coffee supply demanded attention. He'd tied his gelding outside the general store and was examining a new Winchester repeating rifle when the stagecoach rolled in, 3 days late and covered in mud. Among the disembarking passengers was a young woman whose presence seemed to draw all the light in the dusty street toward her. Katherine Sinclair, 20 years old with honey blonde hair pinned imperfectly beneath a blue bonnet that matched the color of her travel-worn dress, stepped onto Montana soil with a mixture of trepidation and determination. Her green eyes, bright with intelligence, surveyed the muddy main street of Silver Creek as if taking inventory of her new reality. Thomas found himself staring, the Winchester forgotten in his hands. When she turned and caught his gaze, he quickly looked away, unaccustomed to the warmth that had risen to his face. "You planning on buying that rifle, or just holding it for safekeeping?" Mr. Wilkins, the store proprietor, asked with a knowing smile. "Just looking," Thomas muttered, returning the weapon to its rack. He gathered his supplies hastily, uncomfortable with the strange disruption to his carefully ordered world. Outside, he was loading his purchases onto his horse when he heard a commotion. The stagecoach driver was arguing with the blonde woman, her voice rising with frustration. "I understand the difficulties, sir, but I've paid for passage to the Elmwood Ranch. My uncle is expecting me." The driver spat tobacco juice into the mud. "Tracks washed out 5 miles north, ma'am. Can't get through for at least a week. You're welcome to stay in town or find another way." Thomas knew the Elmwood Ranch. It sat 20 miles north, owned by old Joseph Sinclair, a reclusive rancher who rarely came to town. He'd heard rumors the man was ailing. "Is there no one who could guide me there by another route?" the woman asked, a hint of desperation creeping into her voice. The driver shrugged, already turning away. "Ask around. But with the rivers up, most folks with sense aren't traveling." Thomas knew he should mount up and ride home. The sensible thing was to let someone else deal with this woman's troubles. The valley between here and Elmwood was treacherous even in good weather, and with the recent rains, the usual trails would be nearly impassable. "Miss," he found himself saying before his better judgment could intervene, "I know another way to Elmwood. It's longer, but passable." Katherine Sinclair turned, relief washing over her face. "You'd be willing to guide me?" "I could," Thomas said, immediately regretting the offer. But it's rough country. We'd need to camp one night. Her eyebrows rose slightly at this, but her chin lifted with resolve. I've come from Boston alone. I believe I can manage one night of camping, Mr. Sutherland. Thomas Sutherland. He extended his hand awkwardly, unaccustomed to such formalities. Katherine Sinclair. Her hand was small, but her grip firm. Joseph Sinclair is my uncle. I've come to care for him in his illness. Something about her directness, her unassuming courage in the face of difficulty, made Thomas reconsider her. This wasn't some delicate Easterner who'd crumble at the first sign of hardship. There was steel beneath those green eyes. By midday, they were riding north along a game trail that skirted the worst of the flooding. Thomas had borrowed a gentle mare for Katherine from the livery, and to his surprise, she sat the saddle with natural ease. My father kept horses outside Boston, she explained, noticing his appraisal. He believed all proper young ladies should ride. Your father sent you all this way alone? Thomas couldn't help asking. A shadow passed across her face. My parents died of influenza last winter. Uncle Joseph is my only remaining family. His letter said he was ill and needed assistance. Thomas nodded, understanding loss too well to offer empty condolences. Joseph Sinclair is a good man. Keeps to himself, but fair in his dealings. You know him well. Know of him, Thomas corrected. Our lands share a boundary to the east. As they rode through the afternoon, Thomas found himself talking more than he had in months. Katherine asked intelligent questions about the territory, the ranching operations, the challenges of the frontier. There was something disarming about her, a genuine interest that drew words from him like water from a hidden spring. They made camp that evening in a protected grove of pines. Thomas built a small fire, and they shared a simple meal of jerky, biscuits, and coffee. As darkness settled over the valley, Katherine wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and gazed into the flames. Do you ever get lonely out here, Mr. Sutherland? The question caught him off guard. Thomas, he corrected. And no, a man can't afford to be lonely out here. Loneliness makes you weak, makes you take risks. She studied him with those perceptive eyes. That sounds like something someone would say to convince themselves, not a truth they actually believe. Thomas stiffened. It's survived me this far. Survived, she repeated softly. Is survival enough? Before he could answer, a distant wolf howl echoed through the darkness, followed by another closer response. Katherine tensed visibly. They won't come near the fire, Thomas assured her. They're just talking to each other. What are they saying? She asked, a small smile playing at her lips. Thomas found himself returning the smile, probably complaining about the weather. Her laughter, unexpected and bright, sparked something in his chest, a warmth he hadn't felt in years. That night, as Katherine slept wrapped in blankets on one side of the fire, Thomas lay awake, troubled by unfamiliar thoughts. Something about this woman disturbed the careful isolation he'd built around himself. Her questions lingered, challenging assumptions he'd held as gospel. Was survival enough? The question followed him into restless dreams. They reached Elmwood Ranch the following afternoon. Joseph Sinclair's foreman met them at the gate, his weathered face grim. Miss Sinclair? Your uncle's been asking for you. His conditions worsened. Katherine's face paled. She turned to Thomas, genuine gratitude in her eyes. Thank you for bringing me safely. I don't know how to repay your kindness. No need, Thomas said, suddenly awkward again. Neighbors help neighbors out here. As he turned to leave, Katherine called after him. Will you come back? To check on my uncle's condition? Thomas hesitated, torn between the pull of his established solitude and the inexplicable desire to see her again. I'll come by next week. Bring some supplies. For the next 7 days, Thomas found himself distracted. Routine tasks that had once filled his days satisfactorily now seemed hollow. His thoughts kept returning to Katherine, her intelligent questions, her quiet strength, the way she'd faced the frontier's challenges without complaint. True to his word, he rode to Elmwood the following week, telling himself it was merely neighborly concern. He found Katherine in the garden behind the main house, her hair loosely braided, her sleeves rolled up as she tended to vegetables. My uncle is stable, she said after greeting him. The doctor says he may recover with proper care, though he'll never regain his full strength. Thomas nodded, relieved for both Katherine and old Joseph. That's good news. Would you like to come in? I've just made coffee. Inside, the ranch house was transformed from the bachelor quarters Thomas remembered. Fresh curtains hung at the windows. The floors were swept clean, and the smell of baking bread replaced the musty odor he recalled from his few previous visits. "You've been busy," he observed, accepting a cup of coffee. "It gives me purpose," Katherine said. "Uncle Joseph needs more than medicine. He needs a home worth recovering for." As summer progressed into autumn, Thomas found reasons to visit Elmwood with increasing frequency. Sometimes he brought game he'd hunted or helped with repairs around the property. Other times, he simply rode over in the evening to share a meal and conversation. Katherine proved to be not just beautiful, but capable and intelligent. She managed her uncle's household with quiet efficiency, learned the basics of ranch operation from the foreman, and even began keeping the account books when she discovered discrepancies in the figures. "You're not what I expected," Thomas admitted one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains. "What did you expect?" she asked, her eyes reflecting the golden light. "Someone softer. Someone who'd break against the hardness of this country." Katherine smiled. "Perhaps the frontier doesn't break people. Perhaps it reveals who they truly are." With each visit, Thomas felt the walls he'd built around himself weakening. Katherine's perspective challenged his most fundamental beliefs about survival and connection. When she spoke of her dreams, to see Elmwood restored to prosperity, to build a life that balanced the beauty and harshness of Montana, he found himself imagining a future he'd never allowed himself to consider. By October, Joseph Sinclair had improved enough to join them for meals, watching the growing connection between his niece and neighbor with knowing eyes. "You're good for her," the old man told Thomas one afternoon while Katherine was in the kitchen. "And unless I'm wrong, she's good for you too." Thomas couldn't deny it. Katherine had awakened something in him, a capacity for joy he'd buried alongside his family. When she smiled at him, the world seemed less harsh, the memories of loss less overwhelming. But as his feelings deepened, so did his fear. The more he cared for Katherine, the more vulnerable he became. The thought of losing her, as he'd lost everyone else he'd ever loved, terrified him. And so, even as they grew closer, part of him held back, unwilling to surrender completely to these dangerous feelings. The first snow fell in November, earlier than usual, blanketing the valley in pristine white. Thomas rode to Elmwood despite the cold, drawn by a force stronger than his fear. He found Katherine alone, her uncle having traveled to Helena with the foreman to consult a specialist. They spent the evening by the fire, talking of books she'd brought from Boston, of his plans for spring calving, of 1,000 small things that somehow felt monumental when shared between them. As the hour grew late, Thomas knew he should leave, but the thought of riding back to his empty cabin seemed unbearable. "Stay," Katherine said softly, reading his thoughts. "The guest room is prepared, and the storm is worsening." That night, as wind howled around the eaves of the old ranch house, Thomas lay awake, confronting the truth he could no longer deny. He was in love with Katherine Sinclair. The realization filled him with both exhilaration and dread. At breakfast, something had changed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of deepening feelings, a tension sweet and frightening. As Thomas prepared to leave, Katherine walked him to the barn. "Will you come for Christmas?" she asked. "Uncle Joseph and I would love to have you." Thomas nodded, unable to refuse her anything. "I'll come." What he didn't tell her was that he'd received word of cattle rustlers operating in the northern part of the valley. Ranchers were organizing to track them down, and Thomas had agreed to join the effort. It was dangerous work, but necessary to protect what he'd built. The rustlers struck Thomas's ranch 3 days later, driving off 12 head of cattle and shooting one of his hands who tried to intervene. The man survived, but the violation of his land hardened Thomas's resolve. He joined 5 other ranchers in tracking the thieves, following their trail north toward the Canadian border. The pursuit lasted over a week, through bitter cold and dangerous terrain. When they finally cornered the rustlers in a remote cabin, gunfire erupted. Thomas took a bullet that grazed his left shoulder, but managed to return fire. When the smoke cleared, 2 rustlers lay dead, 1 was wounded, and 2 were in custody. By the time Thomas returned home, it was December 23rd. His wound, though painful, had been cleanly bandaged by one of the ranchers with medical experience. Exhausted and still processing the violence of the confrontation, he considered staying home for Christmas, retreating back into the safety of isolation. But on Christmas Eve morning, He saddled his horse and rode toward Elmwood, drawn by a promise and a feeling stronger than fear. Katherine met him at the door, her face a mixture of relief and concern. "We heard about the rustlers," she said, taking his coat. "No one knew if you were safe." "I'm fine," he assured her, downplaying his injury. "Just tired." Later, after dinner with Katherine and her much-improved uncle, they sat before the fire while Joseph dozed in his chair. Katherine studied Thomas's face in the firelight. "Something's changed," she observed. "What happened out there?" Thomas stared into the flames, the memories of the shootout still raw. "We found them. There was a fight. Men died." "And you?" she pressed gently. "I killed a man," he said flatly. "Not my first, but—" Katherine reached for his hand. "But it still haunts you." Her understanding, free of judgment, broke something in him. "I've tried so hard to keep everyone at a distance," he confessed. "To convince myself that being alone is safer, that caring for people only leads to pain." He looked at her, vulnerability raw in his eyes. "But then you came, and nothing makes sense anymore." "Perhaps it makes more sense than ever," she whispered. When he kissed her, it felt like coming home to a place he'd never been, familiar and new all at once. In that moment, the walls he'd built around his heart crumbled completely. Christmas Day dawned clear and cold, the world transformed by fresh snow and newfound hope. Thomas and Katherine walked the boundaries of Elmwood, their breath clouding in the winter air as they spoke of possibilities, of futures that no longer seemed forbidden. "I love you," he told her as they stood beneath a snow-laden pine. "I've been fighting it because I've lost everyone I've ever loved. But I'm done fighting." Katherine's eyes shone. "Then stop fighting and start living." Thomas Sutherland. Their happiness seemed complete, until New Year's Day, when a stranger rode into Elmwood asking for Katherine. The man introduced himself as Edward Caldwell, a Boston lawyer. "I've been searching for you for months, Miss Sinclair," he explained as they sat in Joseph's study. "Your father's business partner, Mr. Hamilton, has contested the will. He claims your father promised him controlling interest in the shipping company." Katherine paled. "That's impossible. My father would never. Nevertheless, the court requires your testimony. Without it, you stand to lose your entire inheritance." Thomas felt his newfound happiness slipping away. Katherine's life, her future, was back east. He had no place there, just as she had built a place here. "When must she leave?" he asked, his voice hollow. "The case is set for February 15th. We should depart within the week to ensure arrival in time." That night, as snow fell softly outside, Katherine and Thomas faced the cruel reality of separation. "Come with me," she pleaded. Thomas shook his head. "I can't leave the ranch. Everything I've built is here." "Then I'll return when it's settled," she promised. "It won't be more than a few months." But Thomas had heard such promises before. His mother had promised his father would return from a cattle drive to Wyoming. His brother had promised to be careful riding the north pasture during spring flooding. Promises were just words, easily swept away by fate's cruel hand. "You belong in Boston," he said, the old protective instincts reasserting themselves. "With education and culture and people who understand your world. Don't make promises you can't keep." Katherine's eyes flashed with anger. "Is that what you think of me? That I would make false promises? That I would abandon what we've found together?" "I think you don't know how easily life tears people apart," Thomas answered, the fear of loss making his words harsher than intended. "How quickly circumstances change. Go back to Boston, Katherine. Secure your future. Forget Montana." "Forget you mean," she said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You're pushing me away because you're afraid." "I'm being realistic," he insisted, though his heart was breaking. "The frontier is no place for promises." Katherine left 3 days later, departing on the same stagecoach that had brought her to Silver Creek. Thomas didn't come to see her off, convincing himself it was better this way, a clean break, an ending he controlled rather than one thrust upon him by fate. Winter settled hard across the valley, and Thomas retreated into the isolation he'd once found comfortable. But now the silence of his cabin mocked him, the emptiness a constant reminder of what he'd driven away. February turned to March, and with the first signs of spring came news that staggered the territory. Gold had been discovered in the hills north of Silver Creek. Within weeks, the quiet town was transformed by an influx of prospectors and opportunists. Thomas avoided the growing settlement, focusing instead on spring calving and repairing winter damage to his fences. But the world wouldn't let him hide forever. In April, a letter arrived from Joseph Sinclair, the first communication since Catherine's departure. Thomas, Catherine has won her case and secured her father's legacy. She has sold her interest in the shipping company for a considerable sum. I write not on her behalf, for she is too proud to reach out after your parting, but as a man who has known loss and regret longer than you have been alive. You believe you protect yourself by standing alone, but in pushing away love, you ensure the very emptiness you fear. Catherine returns on the May 15th stage. What you do with this information is, of course, your choice. Joseph Sinclair. For weeks, Thomas carried the letter in his pocket, reading it so often the paper began to wear thin at the folds. As May approached, he wrestled with his fears, with the deep-rooted belief that loving someone meant inevitable pain. On May 12th, catastrophe struck Silver Creek. A fire broke out in one of the hastily constructed boarding houses, spreading rapidly through the dry timber buildings. Thomas was delivering cattle to a buyer when he saw the smoke rising from town. Without hesitation, he rode toward the disaster. By the time he arrived, half the town was ablaze. Men formed bucket brigades from the creek, while women rescued children and valuables from threatened buildings. Thomas joined the effort, working alongside miners and merchants to battle the inferno. Hours into the fight, he heard someone shout that people were trapped in the hotel, the same hotel where stagecoach passengers stayed upon arrival. 3 days early, the Helena stage had arrived that morning. Thomas didn't hesitate. He ran toward the burning building, ignoring shouts that the structure was unsafe. Inside, smoke blinded him as he called out for survivors. On the second floor, he found an elderly couple disoriented by smoke. He guided them to the stairs, then continued searching room by room. In the last room on the corridor, he found her, Catherine, unconscious on the floor, a fallen beam blocking her exit. For one terrible moment, Thomas thought he'd found her only to lose her forever. Then he saw her chest rise slightly. With strength born of desperate love, he lifted the beam enough for her to be pulled free, then gathered her in his arms. The journey back through the burning hotel was a nightmare of collapsing timbers and choking smoke, but Thomas never faltered, driven by the precious weight in his arms. Outside, Catherine was taken to the doctor's tent while Thomas, overcome by smoke, collapsed on the street. When he regained consciousness hours later, it was night, and the fire was finally contained. Half the town lay in ruins, but miraculously, no lives had been lost. He found Catherine in a makeshift hospital tent, her face smudged with soot, but her eyes clear and alert. When she saw him, her expression transformed from concern to joy to cautious reserve. "You saved my life," she said simply. Thomas knelt beside her cot, taking her hands in his. "I thought I'd lost you. When I heard the stage had arrived early, when I saw the hotel burning." "Is that what it takes?" Catherine asked, her voice gentle but direct. "Must I nearly die for you to admit you love me?" "No," Thomas said, finally understanding the truth that had eluded him for so long. "I've been a fool, Catherine. I thought I was protecting myself by pushing you away, but I was just ensuring my own loneliness. The pain of losing you, even the possibility of it, is nothing compared to the pain of never loving you at all." Tears filled her eyes. "I came back for you. Not for Uncle Joseph, not for Montana. For you, Thomas Sutherland. I don't deserve a second chance," he admitted, "but I'm asking for one anyway. I love you, Katherine Sinclair. I loved you when you left, and I'll love you until the day I die." "Then stop wasting time," she whispered, pulling him closer. Their wedding took place that autumn, after the rebuilding of Silver Creek was well underway. Catherine had used part of her inheritance to help establish a proper school and infirmary for the growing town, earning the respect of even the most hardened frontiersmen. Thomas, meanwhile, had expanded his ranch to include part of Joseph Sinclair's land, as the old man had decided to retire to a smaller house in town. On their wedding day, as Catherine walked toward him in a dress of ivory silk, Thomas marveled at the journey that had brought them together. How close he had come to missing this happiness, all because he believed that love was a weakness rather than the greatest strength a man could possess. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared, and as Thomas kissed his bride, cheers erupted from the gathered townsfolk, ranchers, and miners who had come to see the union of two people whose story had already become something of a local legend. That evening, as they danced under stars at their wedding celebration, Katherine leaned close to whisper in his ear, "Are you still afraid, Thomas?" He looked into her eyes, seeing their future reflected there. Children running across open meadows, quiet evenings by the fire, a lifetime of challenges faced together rather than alone. "No," he answered truthfully. "Not anymore." 10 years later, the Sutherland Ranch had become one of the most prosperous in the territory. Thomas and Katherine had 3 children who filled their home with laughter, and the isolation that had once defined Thomas's life was replaced by deep connections to family and community. The lessons he'd learned, that true strength came not from standing alone, but from the courage to love despite life's uncertainties, had transformed not only his life, but the lives of those around him. On summer evenings, visitors to the Sutherland Ranch would often find Thomas on the porch, surrounded by his family, telling stories of the early days to wide-eyed children. But there was one story he told differently to each person who asked. The story of how a Boston-raised woman with honey blonde hair and unwavering courage had taught a lonely cowboy that the greatest risk wasn't loving too deeply, but not loving at all. And though cowboys were known to keep their feelings close and their stories simple, Thomas Sutherland made an exception for this one tale. Because some legends deserve to be told in full, especially those born from the truth that even in the harshest wilderness, love could not only survive but flourish, transforming survival into something far more precious, a life truly lived.